I mean, there are, of course, like you said, there are some wonderful public defenders who have an incredible calling to represent people who deserve effective counsel. But we've also seen, especially in death penalty cases, where there have been ineffective counsel, and that's part of the reason that people end up on death row and why their sentences are appealed. So it's definitely an issue.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 334. I'm talking to Nan Tolson, who is the founder of Texas Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. Yeah, and this is her cause, and Nan's a very smart lady. You know how I know she's a smart lady is because she can spell her name backward and forward.
There are many of us. It's a special.
Anyway, how are you, Nan?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah. So so Texas Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. Obviously, with we're having some. I know Rob Roberson is being executed, and there's some question about his guilt or innocence, and there's a lot of questions about that. It seems like there are always questions about this. How did you get into this? How did this become your cause?
It's a great question. So it actually started when I was in college. So I was born and raised in the suburbs of North Dallas and grew up in a very conservative community. Never really thought much about the death penalty, just thought it was something we did that kept us safe, and it was a way to pursue justice in Texas, until I was a freshman at Baylor and heard a sermon by a guest speaker named Shane Claiborne, who laid out the case for why Christians should oppose the death penalty. And it radically changed my life. It changed my understanding of the death penalty, my understanding of justice, all within the context of my Christian faith. And from that moment on, I knew I could not, in good faith, support the death penalty system. And so that's where it started. And then over time, throughout college, I was involved. I majored in social work, so I was involved in some organizations that helped individuals that were justice involved. I also worked for Governor Abbott for about 5 years when I graduated. And so I had some really unique opportunities to learn more about the justice system and the death penalty system. And it became more than just my faith. As a conservative, as a Texan, as an American, I could not support the death penalty and knew that I wanted to do something about it and use my experience in conservative politics and my values as a conservative to change minds about the death penalty.
This, I can imagine this would be very divisive because I remember that quote years ago that when somebody asked Bill Bennett about investing, and he said, buy prison construction bonds. We're going to be building a lot of them. You have one side that I think is very much lock them up and throw away the key adage, and then you have others that maybe are this attitude that we should be very forgiving. How is that playing out right now, and what percentage of people who identify as conservatives would you say oppose the death penalty?
So to answer the first part of your question, I think something that is missing among conservative spaces are critical conversations about the death penalty, conversations that are rooted in conservative values, that are rooted in data and facts, and also just a respectful, open dialogue. And so that's part of why we exist, is to give conservatives space not only to question the death penalty, but also feel comfortable opposing the death penalty. Because whether it's true or not, it's seen as unusual for a conservative to oppose the death penalty, even though when you really learn about the system and you think about it within the context of conservative values, they're not aligned. And so that's really what our goal is to get conservatives to think about it, connect it to their values, and see that it's incongruent with our conservative values. So that's really why we exist. As far as numbers around how many conservatives oppose the death penalty, It's really hard to tell. We do believe, and this goes for conservatives, libertarians, liberals, if anyone's fully informed on the death penalty, there is a high probability that they are not going to support it because of the myriad of flaws and issues with the system. So, as we educate more conservatives, I mean, my job is here to educate conservatives in Texas, but we have conservatives all over the country that are speaking about this issue. The more conservatives are educated, the more people will come out and say that they are questioning the death penalty, or they have concerns, or they're opposed. There actually has been some polling in Oklahoma, one of our neighboring red states, that polled some Republicans around their views on the death penalty. And they said that the death penalty, at the very least, is not an important enough issue to sway the way that they would vote. So they would still vote for a Republican, even if that Republican opposed the death penalty. And we've also done some very, I would say, unscientific, very casual polling here in Texas, which actually dates back to about 2 years ago when we launched our chapter here in Texas, just trying to get a gauge of people that self identified as Republicans, conservatives, libertarians, moderates, anyone essentially that identified as right of center. And a majority of those people that responded said that they would, at the very least, support a moratorium or a pause on the death penalty. And many of them supported ending the death penalty altogether. So we know that there's momentum, and we know that there are conservatives out there that oppose it. But we are, part of our job is to identify them and mobilize them.
Yeah. Do you think maybe that there might even be some people who identify as conservative who are afraid to come out and say I oppose the death penalty? I mean, I don't know if I don't know of any leading pundits who have come out and said it, for
Yeah,
example.
I mean, I think there definitely is. I think, as you know, we're in a very politically divisive culture, unfortunately, and I think it's gotten worse over time. And I think some people are scared to say what they believe because they're afraid of being labeled as Republican or a Democrat, or being a traitor, whatever it is. We see this with so many different issues on both sides of the aisle. And that is why organizations like ours are so important, because we are conservative and we are here to work with conservatives who are willing to say, hey, maybe the death penalty isn't working. Maybe this is not something that Texas should be investing in and engaging in, and there's a better way. And so that's why it's so important for us to talk to conservatives in a way that's going to make sense to them, because that is truly the way that you're going to reach people and get them to think about this issue in a different way, because it's a very emotional issue. Public safety is something that everybody cares about. That's a universal value, and everybody wants to be able to sleep soundly at night and protect their families and themselves. And so you have to be cognizant of that and sensitive to that, but also recognize that if the government is doing something that's not working, or the government's doing something that's inherently flawed, there's many things the government does that I think fall under both of those categories. But something like this that has so much at stake, we need to be willing to speak out against it, regardless of what people might think.
And that's a question that ultimately has come up in every society. Whether it be the Aborigines in Australia or the people living in the Amazon rainforest. It's what how do we deal with this minority of violent people? It's the murderer. I mean, it's a tough question, and that often, and I think it often has been rooted in, and for a lot of times the penalty for a murder has been you're murdered.
Mhm.
Even going back thousands of years. It's
Yeah.
but I do but also there's also the question of two, and part of this is what's important for me. How are you absolutely positively sure that this person is the murderer unless you see it yourself?
Right. And that's something we have seen more times than we'd like to admit with the death penalty. I mean, there are certainly people on death row, there are certainly people who have been executed that are absolutely guilty of the crime that they were convicted for, unspeakable, heinous crimes, and there should be punishment for that. However, we don't believe that the death penalty is the appropriate method of punishment given the flaws and the concerns around the system. And one of those is the fact that the risk of wrongful execution it's real. 200 people in the United States have been exonerated from death row. That's 217 alone in Texas. And these are just the ones that we've caught. There are going to be more. And as I would say, as pro-life conservatives, it is not worth executing people who are undoubtedly guilty if it means that we are risking or we are going forward with the execution of one innocent person, because that is a complete violation of the value of human dignity, which is something that I believe not only conservatives care about, but all Americans care about. And it is wrong for us to put so much trust in the hands of the government when they can't even seem to get it right 100% of the time. And it's not possible to get it right 100% of the time. It's an imperfect system that's run by imperfect people. And this is something we always like to bring up. We don't even trust the government to deliver our mail on time, much less get something like a conviction and an execution right every single time. It's just not possible. And we'd be better off protecting life and keeping people safe without the death penalty because of that.
And I guess you could frame it as, would you rather see 100 murderers not get the death penalty or see one innocent person get the death penalty? I would, well, assuming, they still get life imprisonment. I think that's, if you're going to err on the side of caution. I assume you can come up with some samples of people who were exonerated after when we couldn't turn back. So can you give me some egregious examples of that happening?
Right. So it's interesting. Usually, I guess I would say, thankfully, we have caught so many cases before that person was executed. And unfortunately, we do have evidence that points to the fact that Texas has likely executed at least 7 innocent people. But it's very, very hard to get a state, not just Texas, but any state, to go back and reopen a case when that person has already been executed. It doesn't seem to be something that's worth their time, worth the money, worth the resources, which is why organizations like ours and so many others try so hard to stop the executions of those that are thankfully still alive, but at risk of a wrongful execution. I mean, just last June, actually, there's a gentleman in Texas named Kerry Max Cook who was declared actually innocent. He was the 199th person exonerated in America, I believe. The 200th came a month after that. It was a gentleman in California, I believe. But this was a case that lasted nearly 50 years. There were a multitude of issues with his conviction. He had been he spent 20 years on death row for a murder that took place in 1977. There were multiple trials, and it's a miracle that he is alive today, and we're so grateful that he is. But had he been executed, that evidence may have never come to light. It may have never been investigated because the state isn't really compelled to look into cases when the individuals have already been executed.
Yeah, and I guess, it's not like you're going to bring them back, whereas I could focus my time on saving somebody who can still be saved. So uh, I'm also curious, what percentage of people who end up on death row had public defenders, and what percentage of people had lawyers that they were paying for? Uh,
That's a good question. I don't have the exact statistic, but I would say it's a majority of people who end up on death row had court-appointed counsel. That's something we've seen quite a bit with individuals on death row, is that if you can afford really good legal counsel, you're not going to get the death penalty. A lot of it comes down to essentially your socioeconomic status. It's a very I would say, unequal method of punishment. And it is disproportionately imposed on not only people of color, but people who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And so that is one of the many problems with the death penalty system.
Yeah, because there's that stereotype, that public defenders don't care. I don't know if it's fair or not, but also I do know in talking to lawyers, a public defender is probably the lowest paid lawyer out there generally.
Definitely.
It's
And
not.
we
It's Yeah,
and
it's
we
very, which is unfortunate because it's very important work, but it's not.
mhm.
You're not. And unfortunately, I think the highest paid lawyers are probably ambulance chasers, but that's another story. But
Right. And I
uh,
mean, we've seen, I mean, there are, of course, like you said, there are some wonderful public defenders who have an incredible calling to represent people who deserve effective counsel. But we've also seen, especially in death penalty cases, where there have been ineffective counsel, and that's part of the reason that people end up on death row and why their sentences are appealed. So it's definitely an issue.
yeah, definitely an issue. You've also pointed out that usually once somebody is sentenced to death row, there are lots and lots of appeals and stuff. And what usually happens after somebody does get the conviction, and then there's they get the death penalty? What usually happens after that? Because you've pointed out that this is usually more expensive than than incarcerating them for life.
Yes. So I can talk a little bit about both. So in Texas specifically, which is my wheelhouse, when a death sentence is reached or a conviction is imposed and the sentence is death, um, that um, that is automatically appealed to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals in a direct appeal. And then if that is unsuccessful, there's some other things that attorneys can do. You can file a writ of habeas corpus with the state court, later with the federal court. You can also seek a review from the United States Supreme Court. There's all sorts of things you can do. There's lots and lots of appeals. It takes decades at times to get to exhaust your appeals if they are not granted. And but so that is one component of the death penalty that costs millions of dollars, because you have all these attorneys, you have to review the trial, the evidence, everything that goes into that. And so that's a huge component of why the death penalty is so expensive. But actually, the exorbitant cost starts when the district attorney decides to seek the death penalty. Because when you have the death penalty on this table, there's a longer pretrial phase, there's more evidence collection, there's more attorneys. At trial, you have to bring in more witnesses, you have to bring in mitigation specialists. I mean, it's this very expensive system. And then on top of it, when you get to the trial, there's two phases. So you have the punishment phase, I'm sorry, you have the guilt or innocence phase, and then you have the punishment phase, which is when you decide death or life without parole. So then that can cost, I mean, millions and millions of dollars. A few months ago, there was actually an article in the Houston Chronicle that showed that Harris County spent nearly $2 million in taxpayer funds to defend a gentleman that was potentially up for the death penalty in his trial, and that was just defense costs. And then in El Paso, we know there was a mass shooting at a Walmart several years ago. They actually reached essentially a plea deal earlier this year where the death penalty is no longer on the table. But that had already cost $6 million in taxpayer funds, and it never even went to trial. I mean, this system drains taxpayer dollars and it wastes taxpayer dollars. And for a state that values fiscal responsibility, it's just kind of mind-boggling how much we spend on this system.
Are the costs more imposed at the county level or the state level, or?
It's at the county level. So counties are the ones that have to put up the money to seek the death penalty. It's why we see so much geographical isolation with the death penalty, because there are so many counties that honestly they just can't afford to seek the death penalty. It's why we see it concentrated in more wealthy counties like Tarrant County, Collin, Dallas, Harris. So that burden does fall on the counties.
Wow. So yes, and you know, is it this also seems to be something you'll generally get with prosecutors. I mean, I've never seen a prosecutor run on the platform of, "Hey, I upheld the Fourth and Fifth Amendment as a prosecutor," but you'll certainly hear a prosecutor campaign on, "I was tough on rape, I was tough on bank robbers," and stuff like that. What can you say about that?
You do. I mean, use of the death penalty has declined in Texas, both the number of executions and the number of sentences, which has been a great thing. But when you do see it being used, you typically do see it with district attorneys that are very proud of their record on being tough on crime and are very proud of putting criminals behind bars or securing justice and things like that. You'll hear these, for lack of a better word, these buzzwords that that kind of signal to people what that district attorney is about. And it's understandable because people are scared of violent crime and people want to feel safe. They want their families to feel safe. And that's completely understandable. So when you hear these district attorneys and just I think public officials in general that tend to run on this tough on crime platform, that's really what they're appealing to, is that inherent desire to feel safe. And so that's why we feel it's so important to kind of at times divorce the emotion from the issue, because realistically and logically speaking, the death penalty doesn't even keep us safe. The evidence is inconclusive at best that it's even an effective deterrent to violent crime. And so when you have these district attorneys running on this platform, it's interesting when it's not even a tool that has been scientifically proven to even keep us safe.
Yeah, sometimes I think politicians more often engage in safety theater than things that actually give us safety. It's having been born and raised in West Virginia, the last person who was executed in that state was on April 3rd, 1959. They officially abolished capital punishment in 1965. And yet I can remember growing up, we often had one of the lowest crime rates in the country, although that may be just because I've often would say, well, nobody here has anything that's worth stealing, so that's why we don't have crime. It's but this is, I look at my home state, which of course was also very blue for a long time and is no longer blue. But I can point to that and just say, I don't think you need the death penalty to have low crime. And what can you say about that? What have you noticed about that? I mean, I think Texas seems to execute about as many people as anybody, but obviously it's the second most populous state. But what can you say about these? Do you have some numbers on this? States with the death penalty versus states without the death penalty and their overall statistics on violent crime.
Yeah, definitely. So there have been some studies that have shown that states with the death penalty have a higher murder rate than states that do not. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's a correlation. Obviously, there's a number of factors that go into whether a state has a high murder rate. It can be everything from the kind of resources communities have. I mean, there's just so many different factors, and the death penalty isn't necessarily one of those. But I do think that it shows that states that are actively executing its own people, that it's not really doing anything to address their murder rates, and in fact doesn't really seem to have any significance whatsoever, good or bad, on murder rates. So that is something that has been pretty consistent for quite a while, and we do see that typically States that actively execute are more in the South, and states in the South do tend to have higher murder rates. So it's an interesting number. Whether or not there's correlation, not sure, but I do think it's definitely compelling and something to think about.
Yeah. One thing you've probably encountered in your activism, being against the death penalty, you've probably, if you go to protest, Robbie Roberson, you're going to have a lot of people there that are definitely not conservatives. In fact, that's where the most of the loudest opposition against the death penalty comes from. What has been your experience working with some of these people? And I mean, how have you bridged that gap? Or are they kind of like, well, why are you here? It's what's happened. What's been your experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been, to be honest, it's been wonderful. I mean, I think the conservative voice, or a conservative voice, not mine, but our organization speaking out about the death penalty has been something that's missing from the conversation about the death penalty for a very long time. It's why Conservatives Concerned, the national network, exists, and it's certainly why Texas Conservatives Concerned exists. Because in order to reach people about such a complicated emotional issue, you have to be able to speak their language, and you have to be able to connect to them on a personal level. And so, I also, personally speaking, I love a good bipartisan moment. I think that's when our country is at our best. And I think that's where we're the most effective. And so, and I think people in this movement, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum, I think that they believe the same. And so it really does take all of us to not only reach people about the death penalty, but to make change at a legislative level. And I think also, especially in Texas, you can't get anything done without conservative buy-in. That is just universal, regardless of the issue. We are a red state, and you have to have Republicans on board if you're going to get anything done. And so we are here to help that and to give people, maybe even people who aren't Republican or conservative, but give them the tools they need to reach the people in their lives that they love, that identify as Republican and conservative, and get them to be able to effectively communicate about the death penalty.
Yeah, who are some of your allies out there? I mean, I'd probably say the Innocence Project, but who are some of the other groups out there that we should know about?
Yeah, so we are actually a
Not just
project.
Texas, but nationally.
Yeah. So, well, first in Texas, because I mean, obviously most of our work falls in Texas, but we were a project of the Texas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, which is a statewide advocacy organization that works with everybody. They're nonpartisan, and most states that have the death penalty, they have a similar statewide coalition. These are usually the organizations that do the most on the ground work, and they're so valuable to the death penalty movement. We also work with organizations like the Catholic Mobilizing Network. They work nationwide and help mobilize Catholics around the death penalty. There's also organizations like Witness to Innocence, which is an organization of exonerees that advocate against the death penalty. The Innocence Project is obviously one that we work closely with. We worked with them quite a bit on Robert Robertson's case. And then there's also some other ones. There's an organization called Journey of Hope. There's an organization called Death Penalty Focus. There's a more focused on the numbers, but the Death Penalty Information Center is a wonderful resource for anyone, regardless of what you think about the death penalty, on the numbers around the system. And they track not only the United States, but worldwide. And then there's also other organizations you may have heard of, like the ACLU, Amnesty International. They all do work on the death penalty, and we all just approach it from different strengths and different perspectives. And I think that's what makes not only the movement to end the death penalty, but I think any important political movement effective.
Well, certainly. Also, and to clarify for anybody who wants to look up the Roberson case, it's just Roberson. That's his last name. So yeah, it's even got a Wikipedia page. So
Yeah.
it looks like he may, at least right now, the execution date is in October. on October 17th. I
Yes,
don't know
it
what will
was.
happen between now and then, but yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to be seen over the next few months. Unfortunately, his new execution date was set last week in Anderson County, and we are certainly continuing to advocate for him and his innocence. And I think his case, honestly, is a great example of kind of that coalition building and working with different organizations and people and rallying around him, because we had not only your kind of anti-death penalty organizations, but you had scientists, you had doctors, you had parental rights advocates, you had people from the Libertarian Party, the Republican Party, different faith leaders, autism advocates. Everybody has come together in support of Robert, and I would credit that to the reason that he is still alive today, and the reason that so many people have spoken up and said that Robert Robertson should not be executed.
It certainly seems like there's some questions here, and that's ultimately why at least we don't necessarily say we want him to walk. We just want him alive. So if something does come up, he can possibly get his life back. Uh,
Absolutely.
is it also fair to say that a lot of these cases might be people who really do have serious mental disorders, and maybe they belong in a mental institution instead of prison? What can you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of patterns with people who are convicted and sentenced to death. A lot do have some sort of mental illness. Some have some really intense trauma, and that is probably more frequent than we like to think. And something I always like to point out is that it doesn't excuse the taking of an innocent life. However, it can explain sometimes why we see such horrific violence. And that is something that I think our organization and other organizations have tried to address over the past several years. I know in Texas there's been some legislation to prevent people with severe mental illness and even people with severe intellectual disabilities from being executed. In theory, these things can be caught in a trial, but they're not always. And so it's definitely an issue that we see quite a bit with people on death row. And this legislation has passed the Texas House with bipartisan support in past sessions. This past session, some of these pieces of legislation didn't receive a hearing, or I think one did. So we didn't see that support around it as much. I think it was just kind of the nature of session and other priorities, but that is definitely something that even people who support the death penalty are usually willing to say, that we should not execute people who have severe mental illness or have severe intellectual disabilities.
Yeah, I asked you too. I mean, would it be possible to put a threshold on the death penalty? For example, if you had a law that said, okay, we'll have the death penalty, but only if you have 10 murder convictions. What has anybody tried to push for something like that? Because there aren't that many. There are lots of people who have a single murder, and usually what happens is they get caught before they commit more murders. But
Mhm.
that would still leave the death penalty, for somebody like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer. But Roberson would be innocent, and obviously too, if you have that many convictions, you're probably more sure of the guilt, but still maybe you're not sure. But what would you think about that?
Yeah, so at least in Texas, the only crime that is eligible for the death penalty is capital murder. And so that is homicide with an aggravating factor. So it can be murder with sexual assault, it can be or essentially during the commission of a felony. So robbery, uh, escaping from prison. It can be the age of the victim. So in theory, there are laws to
Mhm.
kind of limit the death penalty to those specific cases. We have seen, unfortunately, some individuals that are seeking to expand the death penalty instead of limit. But and speaking from Texas conservatives' concerns perspective, we certainly support any legislation that would limit the death penalty or keep more people from being eligible. But that kind of legislation is just unfortunately few and far between. And I think it does speak to, if you were to change it to, instead of one um, murder with an aggravating factor, if it's 10 with an aggravating factor, I mean, in theory, sure, it would hopefully prevent fewer people from being eligible for the death penalty. But we have seen, not just in Texas, but all over the country, we've tried to tinker with this system and perfect it and tweak it and reform it. And it definitely makes a difference. But at the end of the day, it's just fundamentally flawed, and we're not going to be able to fix it completely. And we would be better off just abandoning it entirely and pursuing actually effective public safety solutions.
Who out there does want to expand the death penalty? I certainly believe that there are ones, because I hear this a lot. Say, "Oh, we want this person for the wood chip," or it's yeah. There seems to be. It seems kind of sick the way some of these people talk. But I mean, who wants to expand the death penalty and why?
So it depends on who you talk to. This past year in Texas, actually, there was a piece of legislation that made it through the Senate, Senate Bill 990, that would have expanded eligibility for the death penalty based on the victim's age. And this was something that was authored by some Republicans and was voted out of the Senate mostly by Republicans. I believe every Republican senator voted in favor of it. And so we have seen more of these kind of anecdotal situations where people, not just Republicans, but just Americans, are in favor of expanding the death penalty. Typically, it's around a particular piece of legislation or a particularly egregious case. And then you do have some, I think there's a little bit of I don't know if it's necessarily a stereotype or if there's some truth to it. You have some people who value or identify as very tough on crime. They
Yeah.
very much support the death penalty. There are some that think we don't use it enough. And I think there's probably, a myriad of people that kind of fall in that camp. And it's not just Republicans. I think there's a lot of people that look at it as we need it more because, insert whatever reason, because it'll help keep us safe, or it'll help us enact, pursue justice better in the country, or things like that. I mean, even our president, Donald Trump, has announced that I think it was an executive order, right, when he took office in January, to acquire more lethal injection drugs and make sure that not only the states, but that the federal government can continue executions and that they're not curtailed by limitations with the drugs or anything like that. So there's definitely people that would like to see more of the death penalty, but we're here to have conversations with those individuals, figure out why, and help them hopefully see a different way.
Well, yeah, but it's also seems to be true that especially the ones who hurt kids end up getting the death penalty another way. That's what happened to Jeffrey Dahmer.
Mm-hmm.
He got killed in prison, and I don't know. I am curious what usually happens to inter prison murderers inside of prisons. Do they usually get another conviction, or like the Jeffrey Dahmer case? I'm curious to know what happened with that.
Yeah, so Jeffrey Dahmer was not in Texas, so I wouldn't be
Yeah,
able to speak to kind of the legal
yeah,
stuff around him. I do know that I don't believe he was sentenced to death, actually.
yeah. He was sentenced to life, but he later got the death penalty from his
Yes,
fellow
from
inmate.
a fellow inmate. Yes.
That's what I mean. Yeah,
Yep. Yeah. I mean, we've seen that happen. I believe in Texas, if you are in prison and you kill a fellow inmate or you kill a guard, you might be eligible for the death penalty. I think that's considered an aggravating factor. But yes, you do hear of this kind of justice, if that is what you want to call it. But we would say, and we have members that say, for this reason, being sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole is a pretty severe punishment for a variety of different reasons. But we also think that if you end the death penalty, you will have more financial resources to keep people safe who are incarcerated, whether you're there for the rest of your life or you're there just for a short period of time.
Yeah, and what do you think? Do you think prisons are doing enough to prevent these extrajudicial killings inside a prison? I mean, here in Texas, I can bring up the issue of Yolanda Saldivar, who, of course, killed Selena back in Corpus Christi in 1995, and she's in a woman's prison, but she is a very unpopular inmate because even a lot of women in prison love Selena,
Right.
and and apparently they, I've heard that they keep her isolated most of the time. What can you say about that? Do you think they're doing enough to prevent this from happening, or do you, or what can they do to prevent it from happening? I guess is another question.
Right. I mean, I think the general population is completely separate from death row. And so I obviously know a lot more about
Yeah.
death row than I do the
She's
general.
not. She's not on death row. She's just got life. Yeah.
Right, right. So, I mean, I would say Texas has traditionally been known for pretty tough prisons. It's a not a great environment, not only for inmates, but the people that work in them, prison guards and wardens, and the people that help and serve the people that are incarcerated. And I think there's always room for improvement in our justice system, not even just with the death penalty, but in Texas. I mean, we don't even have air conditioning in most of our prisons, much less have the means to keep inmates safe and ensure that it's an environment where they're kept safe and there's punishment, but also an opportunity for reform and rehabilitation. And so I think what you have brought up is one of a whole host of issues with the Texas justice system and things that should be addressed for sure.
What do you have to say about cases where the death penalty is sometimes used as a bargaining chip? And for example, in the case of Hans Reiser, who was a computer programmer who created the Reiser file system, which is why I know about this. One of the death penalty was used as a bargaining chip, and he said, "Okay, don't give me the death penalty, and I will take you to where the body is." I mean, what can you say about cases like that? And he'd buried. I guess it was his wife. He'd buried the body, and but obviously, and of course, obviously, if you know where the body is buried, that's kind of an admission of guilt too. But
Right.
uh, what can you say about cases like that though? Because
Yeah, I mean, we see it happen. I mean, there was a plea deal in El Paso with the Walmart shooter. It's a great example. That was something that was actually supported by a lot of the victims' families. They didn't want to go to trial. They didn't want to have to, dig up all this trauma. And I think there, I guess for some, there probably is an argument to be made that the death penalty can be used as an effective bargaining tool. But not every person that is facing the death penalty as a potential punishment is afforded that luxury for essentially. And so I think when you have the death penalty, and then you have prosecutors, district attorneys that are using it as a tool, it creates a very unequal method of punishment, because not only, one county may not have enough to pursue the death penalty, so they're not going to use it as a bargaining tool, but then one does have plenty of money to do it. And so it speaks to, I think, the inequality in the justice system, even if it might on its face be seen as an effective tool to not only keep things from going to trial, but maybe finding some sort of closure, like making a deal to lead you to the body, or a confession or things like that. It becomes a little bit of a gray area, in my opinion.
yeah, this is raising it. Again, you're raising the issue of equal justice, man. And I can't help but think of, and while it's not necessarily a case of murder, Ted Kennedy drove a car off of a bridge with a woman in his car, and the bridge goes into a river, and he doesn't even call the police for 10 hours.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and he's elected to the Senate for all these years. What is now? If that had been you or me, we probably would have went to jail. So
Right.
so what is wrong here? Why is somebody in that kind of position allowed to get away with that? And what's going? I mean, can we ever really fix our system here?
Yeah, that's a good question. We see stuff like that all the time. I mean, and I think that's a great example of it. I think, I don't know. I mean, I think when you have power and you have the financial means to hire successful defense, it can shake out a little bit differently for you, whether it's the death penalty or it's a crime like Ted Kennedy, where there was obviously a lot of issues and he certainly should have spent time behind bars. I do think there are ways that we can seek a better justice system. And I think even recognizing that it is an imperfect system run by imperfect people, I don't think that that means that we shouldn't continue to seek a more perfect justice system. Because if it means that we are making reforms and passing laws that are going to make it a more effective system where people that deserve to be incarcerated are there and that their sentence reflects is it an appropriate punishment for the crime, that they're given the tools they need behind bars to be a productive member of their society, whether that's their society in prison or their society, our society, if they were to leave prison and be released. That is what we should be pursuing at all costs, because that will lead, even if we may not get to perfection, but if we improve it, we will ultimately, I think, improve our communities and America on a
Yeah.
whole. And ultimately, we'll keep our communities safer, which is something
Mhm.
that we all care about, we all want, regardless of what you believe about the death penalty or the justice system.
Yeah, one thing that I hear often about too, and I know this was the case with Jeffrey Dahmer, is a lot of these serial murderers, uh, they were caught doing things with animals when they were kids,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know if we, I mean, do you think that might make a difference if we have more laws, like if we prosecute kids for being cruel to animals, then they may not grow up to be murderers, or do you think that would make a difference?
You know, it's interesting. It reminds me of a study that was done few years ago of chiefs of police, where they asked these police chiefs to rank in their essentially their toolbox all of the tools they have to prevent violent crime. And the death penalty was ranked last. But things that were seen as more effective than the death penalty were early intervention for children that may show signs of violence, like you just noted. Things like um, better programs for substance use disorder or alcohol use disorder, keeping things like illegal guns off our streets, better support for family, programs that promoted family values, keeping families together. There are so many other things that are way more effective at keeping us safe than the death penalty or even just excessive punishment. And I think what you're saying speaks to that, that usually there are signs or there are patterns with people who eventually end up behind bars. And I believe we have the data to show what are some effective solutions to that. And now I think we just need to put it in action. And I think ending the death penalty is just one of a lot of things that we can do to prevent violent crime altogether and keep people safe.
I'm mixed on what you call early intervention, because nowadays I hear stories, of kids being sent to the principal's office because they draw pictures of swords,
Right.
and it's almost always boys, and that was before Columbine. Stuff like that never happened, but then after Columbine, it just went crazy,
Right.
and and sometimes I think when you put that label on people, it ends up maybe going to a tendency that is more toward violence, whereas they might not go down that path.
Hmm.
But and this raises the question. I mean, I did have one guy on here who had spent a lot of time in prison, and I think after he's gotten out, he really is trying to build a positive life for himself, and wants to be the good guy. But I mean, are people really rehabilitated, and are they able to rehabilitate? Because it's just like you hear about that addict who goes to rehab and then they relapse. I mean, what can we do? It's
Yeah, I mean, I do think that people are capable of reform, of experiencing remorse, and essentially putting their life back on track. We don't see it with every person. I think every individual is unique and different, but I think for every situation where a person might not um, have experienced that, we see someone that does, and I think we've even seen people on death row that have gotten to a place where they're able to express remorse for their crime if they, those that are guilty, and apologize to the victims' families and become a productive member of their society, which is death row. And that is just as important as preparing an individual that will be released to be a productive member of the external society of our communities. And I think it speaks to the fact that it's not really a one size fits all approach. I think everybody's different. The reason we do things varies between each person, and I think that's why we need to, I think, just step back and step back, but also take a closer look at the way that we treat people that are incarcerated, and figure out how we, as their fellow citizens, better support them, because I do believe that we have an obligation to support those and be near those that are in prison. I think that's something that's mandated in the Bible, and I think regardless of whether you're a Christian or not, that's something that we should all care about. And particularly with death row, it's it's so interesting to hear the stories of people that are undoubtedly guilty and know that they did what they did, and they know that they will never see the light of day. They will be on death row for the rest of their life, but they have made it a point to turn their life around behind bars. And that is obviously something that we want for every person that's on death row. It kind of speaks to our argument of why to be pro life means to be against the death penalty, because all life has inherent value and dignity, and we can respect that whether or not that person is guilty or innocent, or whether or not that person is on death row or walking in our society. And it's up to us to respect that dignity and respect that person in a way that's most appropriate for them.
Yeah, I think this is a question that we that I wrestle with a lot. It's what should I forgive? What should I not forgive? Because it's important to forgive, but it also some if you don't forgive, sometimes it invites a further injury. And you end up getting taken advantage of. But it's a very hard balance to achieve. I mean, I still remember that picture that picture of Pope John Paul with the man who tried to the man who shot him. Now, obviously, Pope John Paul didn't die, but still, he's in the prison, just sitting there talking to him, and it's just I don't even know if they spoke the same language, but it's still one of those images that just sits in my head. And I mean,
Yeah, I mean, we've seen I would say every family member of a murder victim is different. Some are able to forgive the people that, or essentially forgive the perpetrator. Some are not. I think both responses are totally valid. I mean, I certainly oppose the death penalty in all cases. But if something were to happen to somebody that I love, I don't know how it would feel. I think that's a very normal response that a lot
yeah,
of people have. And I think it is totally fair to admit that. I think that is a normal human emotion, and it is in our nature to want justice and to want revenge. But I don't think it means that we have the power or the responsibility to do that. And I think that's where the difference is made. But I do think it's really powerful to hear the stories of victims' families that don't want the perpetrator to be executed or want to give them a second chance. It doesn't always happen, and that's fair, but sometimes it does, and it's a very powerful moment.
well, some will just say, it won't bring my kid back, and
Right.
that's really what they want.
Yep.
Yeah, and this is something else too, Nan. When you have where when people lose faith in the system, they start to do take things into their own hands.
Hmm.
And this was something that happened back in 2017 or 2018. I was very much involved into the scene of Amazonian plant medicines, and this was in Peru. But there was a guy who was down there, who was apparently he was a Canadian guy making threats against people in the tribe. They reported him, and the the authorities didn't do much of anything. As somebody said, they should have just told him to go home, but he didn't get home. But then he ended up murdering a very well respected 80 old woman who had, they don't even know how old she was. She was just a
Right.
respected shaman who was, and then a day or two later, the tribe does what the tribe does, and they, uh, it was basically a lynch mob, and they killed him. And then the people who were accused of the murder, well, they did what they did. They went and
Hmm.
hid out, and they might still be hiding out. And if you want to hide out, the Amazon rainforest is a good place to hide out.
Right.
So, and it just, but they, and obviously, I do wonder if the police didn't care. Well, these are just indigenous people reporting this crime. There's this, because I think the indigenous really don't get a fair deal from the people in Peru who are descendants of Europeans.
Hmm.
But it's really and that's and I worry that might happen more. And we've had cases, in America where that happened. With uh, the famous example of Leo Frank, who may or may not have murdered Mary Fagan, but I don't think we really know that for sure either. It's
Hmm.
where he actually was commuted from the death penalty to the life sentence, and a bunch of crazies went and busted him out of jail anyway and hanged him. I mean, I don't think we want to see that happen here either. But
No, I mean, I think that kind of speaks to, I think, part of the issue with wrongful executions is that if we're not getting it right every time, and this is more of like a mild situation or hypothetical, that if we're not getting it right every time, what else are we not getting right? And there is nothing more serious than a life or death situation. And I think the fact that our country and the state of Texas has willingly um, willingly refused to give a second look to some cases, or even whether that person's been executed or not, I think that is over time going to sow um, seeds of discontent among people, and it's going to have them question the system and question other components of the justice system.
yeah,
And that can be a good thing. It can mean that they can use that energy to advocate for things like ending the death penalty or legislation that would reduce the use of the death penalty. But I think there's always that implication too, of starting something that's more concerning. I mean, obviously, we hope that that doesn't happen, but I think, like you said, there's definitely been situations like that.
I often think that the biggest problem in this country is just the fact that so many people, when somebody is arrested for a crime, they automatically assume that that person is guilty.
Hmm.
And that happens all the time.
Yeah.
And they seem to think, well, why do we? And often this isn't the case. And there are so many cases of various crimes uh, that are definitely proven to be not the case. And it is somewhat the case with murder. At least you're pretty sure that somebody was murdered. You
Hmm.
may not know who did it, but now they might have killed themselves. But some other crimes, it's not so obvious whether or not it might be arson or it might be various sex crimes, that there often isn't clear evidence that it ever happened. So
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen something we hear quite often from people is, well, now DNA has come so far. There's really no way that wrongfully convicted people can be executed or even sentenced to death because of the advances we've made with DNA. And sure, that is the case in some situations, but there are also crimes where there aren't witnesses. I think Robert Robertson is a perfect example. The only people that know what happened that night were Robert and his daughter Nikki. And we've seen this with other cases too, where there were no witnesses and there may not be DNA. Like with Robert, of course, his DNA was all over his daughter's body. That's his daughter, and he's the one that
Yeah.
took her to the hospital. And so, not all of these cases are cut and dry. There's a lot of factors that go into somebody's conviction or guilt, and a lot of factors that can go into questioning that conviction as well.
Yes, there are. And, DNA has worked both ways because it's also helped find some people that were otherwise considered unsolvable.
Mhm.
There was the case of Mia Zapata, who was murdered back in Seattle, and they didn't find that guy until and it was the DNA who gave him away, uh, and and they didn't find him until 8 years later, 2003, and it was because he got arrested for something else, and they found, oh, we've got a DNA profile match here. And then
Right.
they found out, yes, this guy was in the Seattle area at the time of the murder, and so they put it all back together. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think we've pretty much covered everything here. I don't know if there's anything else you want to cover before we go.
I don't know. I mean, I think regardless of what you think about the death penalty, I think it's safe to say there are a lot of concerns and a lot of flaws with the system. It's obviously, like we've talked about, it's fiscally irresponsible. It costs more. This is something that I may have forgotten to mention. It costs more to convict and sentence somebody to death than it does to life without parole. It's 2 to 3 times higher in Texas.
Mhm.
And as conservatives, we value fiscal responsibility. I know this is something that libertarians share as well. And it's a waste of government or a waste of taxpayer dollars by the government. Then you factor in the fact that it is not an effective deterrent to violent crime. It also, the risk of wrongful execution is real. We've talked about how many people have been wrongfully convicted, how many people have been wrongfully executed. And then on top of it, it's at odds with what we consider to be true pro life values. And these are just four of many, many concerns and many, many reasons that people oppose the death penalty. And so, if you are a Republican or you're a conservative, or maybe you're not, maybe you're a libertarian or you're a Democrat or whatever else, and you're watching this and you're not sure what you think about the death penalty, or maybe you support it, hopefully you walked away with one new piece of information about the system. And if you feel that maybe the system isn't working for our country or our state, if you're here in Texas, I hope you'll join us, because nothing's going to change until all of us come together and say that we've had enough and it's time for us to do something different and time for us to actually prioritize public safety by honoring the values that we all claim to have. So if you want to know more about what we do, you can visit our website at tcadp.org/Texas CCATDP. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, Truth Social, YouTube, and Instagram, so you can find us anywhere. And we want to work with you. I mean, Chris, this is how we got connected. I came and spoke to a libertarian
Yes.
organization. I mean, it's literally going to take all of us, all sorts of coalitions and partnerships to make a change here in Texas and across the country. So I hope everyone will join us on this journey.
I haven't formally polled libertarians, but I would say it's probably the majority of them oppose it.
Mhm. It's in the party's platform, right?
There's
Opposition.
yeah,
That's what I thought.
shame to say I haven't looked, but I mean, there's definitely this attitude the government should not have the power of life and death over people. So
Yes.
yes, so yeah, I know there's tcadp.org and several other. There's so many organizations out there too, like the Innocence Project and others.
Yep.
It really does have a broad base of support though. So anyway, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, go buy my novel Escape from the Village, check out my Substack, and people are donating at buymeacoffee.com. So thank you, Nan Tolson. I'm Chris Baker. We're out. Buy my novel Escape from the Village from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you.